My name is Prakash. I work at the Azim Premji University. Welcome to the panel discussion on public versus private schools in a democracy. This panel discussion is part of a set of events which are precursors to the Philosophy of Education Conference, which is an annual conference that Azim Premji University organizes in Bangalore. The idea behind the public talks before, and this is the fourth in this year, is that like what the Philosophy of Education Conference itself tries to do, is to look at education, and there are numerous philosophical questions that come up in thinking about education, and the conference is intended to deliberate on these questions and influence the discourse on education. And every year we do some public talks which focus on some key topical and important events or issues which are being debated quite hotly, if I may say so, for today's topic in India at least. And this year the conference, which starts tomorrow and lasts for 3 days, is focusing on 3 themes: human nature in education, ethics and education, and the last day, notions of public and private in education. So as part of the conference, there are people who have come here, and this panel is going to deliberate on the questions and issues that come up when one thinks about public school versus private school. So I'm just going to introduce the speakers. There are 2 people in the panel here today. Professor Harry Brighouse, who's from University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has directly first-hand experience with education system and education issues both in UK and the US. And he has done a significant amount of work on the notion of education as a public good. And the second panelist is Professor Venu Nayar, who heads the School of Liberal Studies in Azim Premji University. He was one of the co-founders of CFL, Center for Learning School, and he's done a significant amount of work both in economics and in philosophy. So, Venu. And Professor Gurpreet Mahajan was also supposed to come here, but due to some compelling personal circumstances, she was not able to make it for the conference or the event. So today's panel, it was planned to be 3 panelists and 1 person, but she's not going to be here. And Professor Rohit Thankar, who is also part of Azim Premji University, he heads the School of Education in Azim Premji University, and was also is one of the co-founders of Digantar in Jaipur. And he's also participated in a fair number of education interventions directly with government schools, and also has been part of NCRT focus groups in developing the national curriculum framework. So I would like to invite the panelists and Professor Rohit Thankar to the stage and start the discussion. Thank you.
You have 2 excellent speakers today. Both have done a lot of work in education, and both are very keen students of public education. My job is just to sort of give time, and at the end we will have a question hour. So in that, each speaker will take about 25 minutes in their presentation, and then we will have about 25 minutes to half an hour question and answer session. With that, I would request Professor Brighouse to start the presentation.
Thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I just feel like I should say straight away I don't know very much about Indian education. I know a fair bit about Indian cricket, but not very much about the situation here. And I'm very reluctant to make sort of pronouncements about how people ought to do things. You'll notice I'm English. It's not, as you know, the English have not typically been reluctant to make pronouncement on how people should do things, but I am, unless I know a lot about the situation. But what I am going to do is at least, so the argument I'm going to give is a fairly general one, and you can decide how much weight you want to put on it in your circumstances. What I'm going to do is express a general skepticism that private schools and markets in schooling can contribute a great deal to achieving what we want out of an education system. By skepticism, what I mean is not that I think it's impossible, not that I think that markets and private schools are necessarily wrong, but that I think we can identify very clear reasons for thinking that they would be very imperfect at achieving what we want to achieve. But in order to do that, first of all, we have to say something about what we want an education system to achieve. So I've just outlined fairly crudely 4 goals that I think we should have for an education system. The first is the one that everybody, that all politicians talk about, which is that we want the education system to produce a productive workforce, right? And I do think we do want it to produce productive people. How exactly you understand productive might vary between people. For some people it's just, you're only productive if you're contributing more to the formal economy than you're taking out of it. I think that's a naive way of thinking about productivity. Lots of people contribute to society in ways that aren't readily captured by monetary considerations. But overall we want a productive workforce, and we think that schooling should contribute to that. Second, we want it to produce democratically competent citizens. That is, people who are able and inclined to participate pretty generously in the political system and in civil society. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have to vote every time. In the US we have an electoral system in which if you voted every time, you'd be voting 4 or 5 times a year, and usually in elections where it's basically impossible to figure out what anybody who is standing for election thinks. I think it's quite wise not to vote in some of those elections. But when you do vote, a democratically competent citizen, when they do vote, they do not simply vote their own material interests. What they do is they consider carefully what the right thing to do is. And they do that by thinking about what other people's interests are and how important other people's interests are relative to their own. The third thing we wanted to do is produce adults who in adulthood are capable of making and acting on independent judgments about matters of value, about how to live their lives. They don't simply take their values from their parents or from their communities without thinking them through, without reflecting on them. Now they may end up having the values broadly that their parents have. In my case, I pretty much have the values that my dad has, largely because I've argued with him and convinced him that the values I have are right and the ones he had were wrong. I'm kind of kidding there, not entirely. But you may end up sharing the values of your society or sharing the values of your parents. but you do so after reflection and with reasons, not because they're the values of your society or your parents. The final thing we want from a schooling system is a schooling system should be concerned with justice. And the way I think of justice basically is a society is just when the people who are worst off in that society are as well off as they could be, right? Or as well off as the worst off people could be. And so what we want is an education system that channels opportunities and well-being toward the less advantaged. Okay, so those are 4 things I think we want from an education system. Why isn't parental choice, why aren't markets and private schools likely to produce those 4 goals efficiently? Well, just think about an education system now in which the government plays no role at all. So the government doesn't regulate it. I mean, it regulates schools the way it regulates other businesses. You know, they can't steal the money. Bribery is not okay, or it might be a little bit okay. So they pay taxes, but they're not subject to any education-specific regulation. The government doesn't fund schools. It doesn't spend any money on schooling, and it doesn't provide schools. It doesn't even compete in the marketplace. It doesn't even sort of have its own schools which it tries to get people to go to. This is the way that we. This is the way that in many countries, anyway, most consumer goods are produced and distributed on a market like that. Why do I think? So that's the sort of pure market case, the pure private market case. Now, I think we've got very good reasons for thinking that a system like that will not produce the goods that I've described. And the reason is that parents in that kind of system are going to be the ones who are going to do all the choosing and all the paying, right? And the interests of parents, the legitimate and reasonable interests of parents, do not align with what we want from an education system. So think of the first and last things I mentioned. So productivity and benefiting the least advantaged. The interests of parents when they're thinking about their kid's schooling and making choices for their kid is in their kid, right? Making sure that their kid gets a good education. Now that does not necessarily mean that that doesn't necessarily enhance productivity. Suppose you have a kid who will be a great nurse, just a terrific nurse. That's the way that he will contribute the most to society, the way that he will enhance productivity the most. But he'll be a reasonably good, not a great, but a reasonably good accountant, right? You know, if you spend enough money on his schooling and you have the money, you will be able to get him to be an accountant because other people won't have enough money to spend to get their child skilled up in that way. So he'll become an accountant. He'll earn a lot more money than if he's a nurse. He'll have easier working conditions and less stress than if he's a nurse. But it will not serve productivity maximally. It'll serve him maybe best, might serve you best, but it won't serve the society best in terms of productivity. Nor are you going to be trying to, are you going to act in ways that channel opportunities to the less advantaged. What you're typically going to do is you're going to spend the money on your kid, on getting your kid advantages, on getting your kid educated. Now, of course, if you're less advantaged yourself, then your kid comes from a less advantaged background, and in trying to benefit your kid, you are channeling opportunities to the less advantaged. But of course, because you're less advantaged, you have less money to do that with. You're going to be out-competed for all sorts of resources by the people who have more money, the more advantaged. The tendency is going to be, in a system of the kind that I've described, not for us to get a more just society, but for us to get an ever less just society, as advantage is passed down through generations and disadvantage is passed down through generations. The final thing is democratic citizenship. Generous participation is costly to the person who participates. We do not want, so, of course, I want a political system in which the people who are treated unjustly do pursue their interests, their own interests. Why? Because in pursuing their own interests, they are pursuing justice, they're contributing to justice. Right? They're making the society more just by doing well by themselves, and not because it's their interests that they're pursuing. People who are born into privilege or who grow or who find themselves in privileged situations as adults, by and large, should not be voting in their own interests. They should be, that when they vote, they should vote in a way that costs them something. Now, typically, parents are going to be less interested in making sure that their children do good things for other people than in making sure that their children get good things for themselves. And they are liable to underinvest in the development of the capacity for generous participation in democratic processes. Oh, that wasn't the final one. Now I've got the final one. The final aim was producing people who can make their own independent judgments. Now, I think parents typically, and I think pretty reasonably, want to maintain close cultural and values-related ties to their kids. I'm an immigrant to a foreign country, and my children are of that country. So we have, they're English. They've got English passports, but they're not English. And one of it's important for me, as it is, I think immigrants experience this a lot. It's important for me to share culture and values with them. And the way I've done that is, the way I've achieved that is by forcing them to watch cricket all the time, which is just great. They love it. That really was a joke. But they have lots of exposure to the culture I bring with me. And they do share it in a significant part. It's going to be they share it because it's mine and because I brought it to them. I think it's fine for parents in general to do that in the home. But in doing that, what you need processes outside of the home which are challenging that, in which your children are being exposed to very different kinds of things. The example that I think of a lot is, and it's something I feel very conflicted about. I'm an atheist, and my wife is an atheist too. My children have grown up in an atheist home, and they identify with it unthinkingly. The younger two are unthinkingly that, well, we don't believe in God in our house, do we? And my wife always says, no, we don't. And I always say, well, I don't. You may or may not. I want you to make that judgment for yourself. But what I don't do well is provide them with the kinds of experience, the kind of opportunities in which they get to genuinely understand what it's like to live within a faith tradition, what it's like to believe in a God, what it's like to be part of a religious community over an extended period. To get that, they need to get that outside of the home. And typically, what parents are going to do is they're going to use the choices that they're making about their children's schooling not to put their children in situations in which the values that they share with their children are challenged, but in situations where the values that they share with their children are reinforced. Parental choice makes it much more difficult, certainly unregulated parental choice makes it much more difficult for us to achieve that goal of getting independently minded people who can make their own and act on their own judgments. Okay. So for some people that should just be enough to prove my point, but let's suppose it's not. Let's suppose that in fact we've solved the parental preference problem. So let's suppose somehow we've got a world in which parents' preferences about their children's schooling align perfectly with what it is we want from an education system. Still, there are going to be problems. And the problems are really just to do with the fact that markets in education are inevitably, they're inherently highly imperfect. They're not anything like as capital markets. Capital markets are now very fluid. What they do is, in my view, socially suboptimal. But in terms of the flow of capital, they're pretty efficient. Markets in schooling are going to be much less efficient than that. Why? Okay, there are three reasons why. Or at least I've got three reasons. There are probably lots more, but here are three. So the first is that intrinsically, schools there are going to be limited numbers of providers. Why? Because a school has to be a certain size in order to be cost effective. And I think it probably has to be bigger than that in order to be educationally effective. Children, in order to get the kinds of things they need to get in order to become, first of all, productive, but probably even more so, competent democratic citizens and people who are capable of making their own independent judgments, in order to get that, they have to be in schools that are big enough to provide them with a peer group that is reasonably diverse, and a set of teachers that are reasonably diverse. Now, I gave this talk a couple of days ago in Delhi, and I can see that in Delhi, given the population density, you could have quite a lot of schools to choose from within walking distance or easy driving distance. Not that any distance seems easily drivable in Delhi to me. It seems like it's all difficult, but in most places, even most places in quite densely populated countries, let alone in places like the US, which are not very densely populated at all, that's not going to be the case. It's going to be that you have maybe 3, maybe 4 providers at most that are viable for you, given that schools have to be big enough. That means when you have choice only between 3 providers, it's very hard for the market to operate to have the disciplining effect on those providers that we want markets to have. The second reason has to do with how difficult it is for parents to know what is good schooling for their kid. So the truth is, it's really hard to know what's going on in schools. Researchers will tell you that. Government officials will tell you that. Parents will tell you that. The only people who won't tell you that are children, pretty much. I think children often know quite a lot about what's going on in schools. My daughter, who just graduated from high school, she knew the name of every drug dealer in her school. Unlike any of the teachers or any of the police, I mean, there were no adults who knew the name of every drug dealer, but my daughter and all her friends did. Not that they purchased, I mean, they weren't even clients, but they still knew the name of every drug dealer. Well, one of them was, but it's so hard to know what's going on, and it's hard to know what the school quality is on average. For a parent, what you're trying to find out is how good the school is for your kid, right? And you need to know that before the fact. And I'll explain in a minute why you need to know that before the fact. But you need to know that in order to make a good choice, you need to know it before you've made the choice. And typically parents don't have that kind of information. And you see that in systems which have a lot of school choice, a lot of parental choice built into them. A lot of parents rely on, one thing a lot of parents do is they look at how close the school is to their home. Another thing they do is they rely on rumour. Another thing they do is, which I think is not a stupid thing at all, in the circumstances, they try and figure out how safe the school is. And another thing they do is they try to they look at their children's friends, and if the friends seem like they're a reasonably good influence, they send them to the school that their kids' friends are going to go to. And if they think the friends are a bad influence, typically they still send them to that school anyway, because the kid, certainly in the US, the kid is going to fight if you don't. But you know, you might try not to send them to a different school. So you don't have the kind of knowledge that we have even when we buy cars, fairly large and infrequent purchases like cars. Even houses. You know more about a house when you buy it than you do about a school when you put a kid in school. And cars and houses matter a lot less than schools do. It matters a lot less that your car is really good or that your house is really good. And one of the reasons is people are making those decisions all the time. So that is affecting because those decisions are being made frequently, there is a discipline effect. Also just because it's not education. Education matters because it's transformative. Okay, why does it matter so much that you know before you make the choice? The reason is, and this is the third problem with educational markets, you must not move your kid from one school to another very often. Compare this with breakfast cereals. That doesn't work here. Candy. Compare this with candy. Okay, sweets. You buy a sweet, you eat it, it wasn't very good. Maybe you even spit it out. Depends how obsessive you are, right? And what do you do next? You buy another sweet. And then you didn't like that one, so you buy another sweet. And over the course of 4 weeks, you may have bought 28 different kinds of sweet. And at the end of 4 weeks, you found a sweet that you really like. And then you carry on buying that one. You cannot do that with schools. Because every time you move a kid from one school to another, you're damaging their education. In order for a school, in order for it to be worth moving your kid from one school to another, the school that you're moving it to has to be much, much better than the one that you're moving it from. Because it's a leaky bucket phenomenon. You're wrecking their education by moving them, and so the compensation has to be much better. You're not going to do that very often. Partly because you don't know what's going on in the schools, so you move the kid from one school to another without really knowing anyway which is good and which isn't, until you have the kid there. This makes it impossible for markets to discipline providers in the way that we want markets to discipline providers. They're just not going to be able to do that. Now, those are reasons for thinking that markets are going to be very imperfect. You might think, nevertheless, in response to my last comment, well, parents, knowing that they've got the kids stuck in the school, will exercise voice. They'll go into the school and they'll improve it, right? I don't think that's what parents... if parents do that, I think they're making a mistake. Because getting an improvement in a school takes years. Now, getting an improvement for your kid, that is, getting the good teacher assigned to your kid instead of to another kid, that takes much less time, and you can do that. But that doesn't improve the school at all, right? That doesn't improve the quality of the school at all. It just improves the quality of the education your kid is getting at the cost, at an exactly similar cost to another kid. So that is not doing what we want markets and parental choice to do, which is improve the quality of schooling. Real change takes a long time, and your kid is not going to be in the school for a long time. Your kid is going to be in the school for just a few years. The rational thing to do, if you're caring about your kid's education, is to get a quick fix. That is, go into the school and say, demand that they give your kid the good teacher or whatever it is. Or, and I think this is something that I observe people doing around me a lot, you just think, okay, she's never going to learn math in school, I'm going to teach it to her, or I'm going to get somebody else to teach it to her, if you have the time, energy and effort. So that's what privileged parents do. Privileged parents fill in when schools don't do well. Right? That does not do anything to improve the school at all. In fact, what it does is it makes the school worse. Right? Because, and I just was on a dissertation committee, a very brilliant quantitative researcher who was looking at teacher evaluations and evaluating teachers on test scores. And he was saying that teachers who get worse value added in test scores are identifiable. I said, is that really right? Do you really think they're worse teachers? Because lots of the teachers who are getting better value added in test scores aren't getting it because they're teaching. They're getting it because, having not taught well, they've got a group of parents who are doing the teaching instead. The school looks better when you fill in for it than it does if you let it do what it does. And because it looks better, it's less vulnerable to market discipline. So I'm pessimistic, not totally opposed, but pessimistic about private schools and markets delivering what we want for an education system. I'll make one final comment. I'll make two final comments. The first final comment is this. What I haven't done is shown that governments do better. Right? So governments vary a lot in their competence. And some governments are deliberately incompetent at something. So the US government has been deliberately incompetent at, not at invading Iraq. It was, I don't know if that was deliberate incompetence, it's just sort of there. But it's deliberately incompetent at providing healthcare. And it's deliberately incompetent at providing healthcare because there's a huge political pressure on it not to provide healthcare efficiently. Because if it did, it would do lots of businesses out of profits that they're determined to make. That's why we do not see movement toward a single payer or a nationalized health system in the US. That's why when reforms are made, they're made in ways that benefit insurance companies. If your government is sufficiently incompetent, you might think, well, with all the problems in markets, with all the problems with markets, nevertheless, we're still going to use markets because they're terrible, but the alternative is worse. I would warn against embracing that. So I'm not warning against. I understand why somebody would think that. I understand why somebody would do that. And that may sometimes be the right thing to do. My warning against embracing it goes back to the US healthcare case. Once you abandon some proper government activity to the market, it's really, really difficult to get it back, right? It's really difficult to get it back because what you've done is you've set up constituencies, lobbies, interest groups that are going to fight you whenever you try to get it back. They're going to try and do what the healthcare lobby has very effectively done in the US, which is make sure that the government continues to be incompetent at this. And they'll fight legal changes, they'll fight attempts to improve whatever government provision there is, and they'll continue to do that. You've basically set up a system in which you can't win. So, unless you have a revolution, and revolutions, you know, I'm all for revolutions, but I'm all for revolutions as long as other people have them and have to live with them. I'm not a huge optimist about governments, but I'm more of a pessimist about markets and private provision.
For his presentation before our discussion.
Good evening, and thank you, Rohit, and other colleagues in the Philosophy of Education unit in Azim Premji University for inviting me to this evening's panel discussion. I must apologize for what I foresee will be occasional failures of my voice. I'm just recovering from a bad chest infection, but I don't think that will stand in the way of my communicating what I wanted to do this evening. Also, thanks to Professor Brighouse, some of the arguments I needed to bolster or one or two of the points I want to make, he has already made, so I can use that time to extend or use the time to make some of the other arguments I want to make. So to begin with, I don't intend to take the theme of today's discussion head on, or take a position on the seemingly clear choice that the title presents, that is public versus private. Instead, I plan to outline a view that policy options are more complicated and hybrid. And my purpose is to highlight the changes we have to make in the Indian education systems to respond to concerns from two broad perspectives. The first perspective is that of a democratic nation whose constitution creates certain rights and provides certain mandates and offers a picture of what a good society would mean in the long run in the Indian context. The second perspective that arises is from the demands that education itself, the nature of education itself, imposes on our thinking. Firstly, that of a democratic republic and conceptions of education that imposes on us necessarily. The second one is the perspective of what good education could be and has to be. The constitutional mandates are very clear and fairly well known. So the Constitution treats justice, liberty and equality within a democratic framework as the highest political goods and expects the state to promote equality of status and opportunity. The Constitution identifies education specifically as one of the principal means of securing these goods. And as you all know, both the earlier provisions and some of the recent legislative initiatives require the state to endeavor to make free and compulsory education available to all children below the age of 14 years. So, in view of these mandates, where are we? Where have we reached? Where are we placed? Over the last 2 decades, schooling has become the most accepted form of educational provision, with over 96% of children in the relevant category being in school. However, we see a fairly complex and unusual distribution of educational provision. Public, pure private, and aided private schools coexist in a fairly complex school environment. So, access to education that affords superior socio-economic possibilities is very unequally distributed, and that distribution is deeply influenced by the socio-economic advantages that households possess. Another remarkable feature of Indian school system today is how dramatically the last 20 years have seen the increase in private provision. Over 36% of students are in private schools of one kind or other, and the number of students in private school systems in elementary grades, that is grades 1 to 8, went from something like 35 million in 2004-05 to 71 million in 2013-14. In the same period, the number of students in the elementary education system in public schools stagnated at around 121 million. Don't take these numbers very seriously. There are likely to be errors in collection, reporting, and perhaps even deliberate errors induced in this. But these numbers give you broad and fairly accurate trends of what is happening in elementary education. The quality of learning outcomes has stagnated at a fairly low level, as numerous studies and reports highlight. Outcomes in basic reading and arithmetic, students in class 5, even very recently, in the last few days, the ASER report for 2014 highlights that students in class 5 are barely able to read class 2 texts. So, while enrollment in elementary education is almost total, it also drops off fairly precipitously when students move to secondary education and high secondary education, and even much more in higher education. So it's a fair conclusion that the promise of education as the great leveler that the Constitution dreamt of is yet to be realized to any significant extent. The next question that I want to pick up, next theme that I want to pick up, is something Professor Brighouse has touched on and given good reasons for, so I can fast forward to that, through that. The question is, why educate at all? Apart from the requirements that the Constitution has imposed. So I would argue that the need to educate is much broader than conceived of in our Constitution or any Constitution, because the Constitution is an instrument of political organization, something that organizes a political community. But education reaches much beyond that. So I'll adopt the fairly well-known notion that good education promotes flourishing of the individual and society as a whole. While the scope of flourishing is wide open, let me pick three key dimensions of its realization: work and livelihood, social and political participation, and personal growth and realization. Each of these offer intrinsic and instrumental reasons for valuing good education. Let's take the question of work and education. In 2012, the Indian economy has had something like 480 million people in the labor force. 45% of these were in the agricultural sector, 55% in the non-agricultural sector. More than 72% of those in the non-agricultural sector are in the informal economy, thereby implying that most of them work without any stable guarantees on wages, on their contracts, on their working conditions, or without any guarantee of any social safety net if they should lose their source of employment, whether due to economic reasons or through accidents of their fate. So needless to say, the opportunity for secure and stable employment escapes the majority of Indians in the workforce. And we cannot escape the conclusion that rapid economic growth of the last two decades or so has not enhanced the opportunity for secure livelihood that to the extent that one could hope for. This could be a failure both of the opportunities for employment in the economy and also the competences that are required to be employed. The latter, at least to some measure, is a failure of the education system. So, I have alluded to, but I will leave aside without much discussion the intrinsic contribution that meaningful work and livelihood makes to human well-being. What about social and political opportunity? In spite of the robustness of the degree of participation in electoral politics that Indian polity can be justly proud of, the gains from political participation have not translated to economic and political gains for the majority in the way one would have hoped for. Nor has there developed a fully shared conception of justice and nationhood that underpin India's political and distributive institutions. And the failures in educational provision in some way mirror this failure. So this suggests a hypothesis to me, which I would present without presenting any detailed arguments to defend it, that post-independence India's failure to more fully realize the dreams of justice and egalitarian prosperity are linked at least partly to the failure of the education system to promote the capacities key to enhanced opportunities for all. The education system has also perhaps failed to build, construct an institutional structure that is more fully democratic. I come to my third theme, that of personal growth and well-being. So good education nurtures those capacities necessary, important for a well-lived life. The list of those capacities is, of course, an open list, not a closed one. But some capacities, in the context of our discussion today, can be counted as basic. Ability to think critically, reflect wisely with feeling and imagination, and the ability to relate to as large a part of the world and perhaps the cosmos as that one may wish to. These are some of the intrinsic benefits of a good education. Accomplishment of these is matter both of the conception of education and sensible choices students and their parents and the household makes. The failure to attend adequately to these and instead focus more narrowly on economic achievement is a disappointing trend in Indian education. and narrowly conceived educational visions and narrowly focused household interests are perhaps to blame. So I would argue that more just outcomes in these domains, sustainable livelihood, democratic political voice, and a personal life that people value, are all the more important for a future where humanity may have to discover flourishing under conditions of much more diminished opulence. And far less inequality may be necessary than what the last 100 years have produced. I suspect that education will have much responsibility for this transition, if it is to happen relatively peacefully without social and political turmoil. So with this background, here is the question I would like to present for this evening's discussion. What changes in the structure of educational provision would we want to make if our concern is to enhance the quality of outcomes for the largest proportion of the student population, in particular those who are least advantaged? Or in other words, what are the educational arrangements that maximize the probability of achieving greater justice, opportunity for meaningful work and personal well-being for as large a fraction of the student population in India as possible? The answers to this question are closely bound to the possibilities for meaningful reform in the nature of access and quality in Indian education. The three central institutional systems, the public education system, the private school systems, and the households, and three key policy domains of provision, or three key domains that policy is interested in: provision, funding, and regulation. All of them influence access and quality, and they have a complex set of interactions with each other. So many of the arguments around proposals to reform education in India have been around redrawing the boundaries between the public and the private. I would like to argue that these boundaries are not as clear and well defined as one may think. Secondly, some of the restructuring is happening very much as we speak through choices, forced and voluntary, exercised by the various participants. Let me take each of these very quickly. The government school system is not monolithic. It is diverse, in some cases fragmented, and very, very geographically distributed, and does not answer to a single master. Yet it has common features. One of them is that the government school system has managed through fairly large investments, financial investments in infrastructure and other matters, to push up, to increase access to most of the students in the elementary school age. However, failures in provision are also glaring. And that failure, government failure, is related to and also worsened by the ease with which vested interests with political power can hijack and distort educational policy and regulation. And as I mentioned earlier, households who can afford to voluntarily are deserting public schools in droves. Clearly, the thoroughgoing reform of organizational and curricular aspects is extremely urgent. Now, household choice, I would like to argue, is not a new phenomenon. It has always existed to a greater or lesser degree, and economic growth of the last few decades has widened the kinds of choices households have, and they're exercising it very strongly. And that exercise of household choice is very closely linked to increasing private provision. So, in spite of restrictions, now what are some of the key features of private provision that we should be concerned with this evening? in spite of restrictions on for-profit schools, a significant fraction of private schools extract surpluses in some way or the other. Now, education is rarely ever a source of stable or sustainable surplus or legitimate surplus. Now, Professor Brighouse outlined some of the reasons why that is not so. So much of, there are many reasons, particularly in a highly unequal society like India, the inability of households to meet all costs is an important reason. So the idea that private provision can be cost effective, I'm skeptical about that. The only reason private provision can be truly cost effective is by repressing teachers' wages. And this requires a particularly narrow conception of the work of the teacher and a conversion of teaching into a more mechanical activity. And most definitions of teaching and learning, particularly economistic ones, are guilty of this. So these, now I don't mean to imply that the government, the households, and the market and private providers only thing that they can do reliably is to fail. No. However, in looking at redrawing the boundaries of provision, we must look at not eliminating obviously the successes, but the failures, and the three important failures of government, governance, market failures, and failures of imagination and choice by the households. Each of them need to be addressed. So what's the way ahead? Firstly, the reality of government failure, however systemic, does not or is not a strong argument for privatization. The argument for privatization, if there are strong such arguments, have to stand on their own. So, evidence of government failure, therefore, is an argument for improving government schooling. Now, the argument that pure unregulated private provision is self-correcting, that's also unconvincing. Market failure is not an accident. It is structural to any market system. Now, we have enough trouble regulating markets of soap and toothpaste. And education, complex, delivered over, if you want to think of it as a market commodity, delivered over long periods of time, largely or substantially to communities and households who do not have stable and clear ways of accessing information and evaluating the nature of educational provision. This is a market waiting to fail if left to the market completely. However, in the same earlier vein, market failures do not require that they eliminate all private provision. The structure of democratic choice requires that there should be adequate and protected spaces for private initiatives in education. Now, household myopia, in household imagination of the nature of education, or short-sightedness in the choice of educational provision is not an argument for eliminating household choice either. Households do make bad choices. And all of us know that when it comes to educating girls, Indian households consistently make bad choices, at least from the perspective of democratic justice, and definitely from the perspective of women. And many of the reasons why, and as for government choice and government failure, many of the reasons why households are voting with their feet has to do with the government system being completely insensitive and tone deaf to some of the things households legitimately need. for you. And that brings me to the last 2 or 3 minutes of what I have to say. What is the way ahead? There is no alternative democratic pressure for reforming the role and capacity of the state. On most days, I despair about the ability of the Indian state to clean up its own act or even deliver any semblance of justice. There is far more evidence about the fact that the Indian state is predatory and kleptocratic than it is concerned consistently with justice and effectiveness in education, just as in many other things. Still, we do not have a choice. As citizens of a democratic polity, we have to work hard towards improving government provision. However, the distinction between the public and the private is not just that of ownership and funding, but is also of intent and motivation.
Having question answers now. What we will do is that I'll request you to articulate your questions sharply, and let's keep our questions to the presentations and the theme. We will take about 5 questions at a time, then both the presenters will respond to those questions, and then we'll take another round, and as long as you please and we have time, we will continue. Thank you.
How do you see the Right to Education Act, how going forward? I mean, it was introduced by the UPA government, the present government. Do you see it taking forward, and how would you, what would you recommend to the government?
I wanted to understand a little more on what you said about the role of private education. You mentioned something like it is important to provide protected spaces for provision of, initiatives in private provision of education. And you also suggested that there are changes required from the way things are. So if you could elicit it a little more about, what is that protected space that is required, what kind of protections, what kind of changes do you suggest? I mean, that would be helpful. Thank you.
If government runs all the schools, then if the government doesn't run all the schools, then the poor will remain poor and the rich will remain rich. So my question is that if the government runs all the school and provides free education to all, then don't you think the money that the government will spend on the upper section of the society will be the misuse of the money or the tax that it collects from the common people? And the second question is, in a society where we dream about a society where every school is managed by the government and there is no private schools, then don't you think this action itself is undemocratic? Because all the schools run by government will give enormous power to the state, and the state can mold its students in the way whatever it likes.
Mr. Harry. Here we have a lot of choice in terms of schools. We have international schools, boarding schools. In private schools, there are premium private schools. There are well-known chain of schools, and there are medium and low private schools. So a plethora of choices, like a market menu we have here. So still, there are complaints from every section of the parents, whether irrespective of the kind of school they opt for. So in terms of market economy, there is a variety, but still market mechanism is not working here.
So, one of your arguments I didn't find convincing is that you said there is less scope for if the country was dominated by private schools, then there would be less scope for the children to be exposed to other values and make their own decision. So I was wondering, especially in a place like India, where recently there have been this spurt of cases where textbooks are carrying more and more, the government trying to force their own values on children. I mean, I feel like there's probably more exposure to different views and different kinds of outlook if there were private schools and if children were not forced to study from textbooks where they were told, given one version of history or one version of, so you still stand by what you say?
The first question was about the Right to Education Act. What's its impact likely to be? What's its role in this whole debate? See, this is a complex omnibus piece of legislation which doesn't have a single focus. One or two of its provisions have, of course, drawn disproportionate attention, but this is a piece of legislation that attempts to change or impact both access and quality through its various measures. Of course, some of the provisions on access have drawn a lot of debate and attention. Now, this is also a example of the lag between conception and implementation of public policy, particularly when it is legislative, and the impact it has when ground conditions all change. Now, many of the debates around the RTE, as I understand them, happened just before or immediately after the turn of the century. At that time, the provisions or the access was still an important issue. However, and it perhaps at the thinking of the time made sense to make opportunities for students to move to the private educational system. But both the investment by the public and the fact that we already are at almost complete enrollment means that the government is currently paying students to move to the private sector, which is perhaps unnecessary. So, in a way, a kind of a hidden voucher system already exists. The second issue, of course, is that the RTE's provisions are extremely difficult to, are complex, are difficult to implement, complete clarity about how they will be funded, who will finance them, none of them are totally clear. And there is a real risk that there will be some kind of administrative and judicial exhaustion in trying to implement something like that. Does the RTE have a serious role to play in improving quality? Yes, of course, it might. Could it have been done better with more democratically questionable administrative and executive action? That argument can be made. The second question is about the role of how do you protect and what is the nature of the protection that we should give to private initiatives. My first one is a general argument that in any democratic system, private initiatives, civil society initiatives in education, the space for that cannot be closed. I cannot think of a strong enough argument which says that the demands of justice, equity and opportunity can be met only by state provision. Does that mean that private provision there has to be some kind of a laissez-faire? No, most definitely not. As both of us suggested, that no market, the very existence of markets is predicated on regulation, on the existence of informed and intelligent regulation. Therefore, that's true of education also. However, the Indian state very often errs on what I would call a sledgehammer approach to regulation. So that is something to be watched out for. I will not go much more on that. The second point is private initiatives very often, not always, but very often, arise from certain deeply felt visions, ideas and conceptions of education, and try to translate them into pedagogic and other kinds of initiatives which have a positive effect on ideas about education. Now, I will not generalize it to across all kinds of private initiatives, but I think the history of alternative education in this country is rich enough to merit serious consideration and spaces to be created for that. There is a very, very small but and budding homeschool movement in India. Even those opportunities need protection.
Okay. Well, I'll try to stick to the questions that I think I know how to answer. So the first one I think was about the worry about the autonomy of taxpayers. So there's is there this contradiction that I'm sort of talking about making autonomous children or become autonomous adults, but then I'm saying that people have to be taxed to pay for education. I just don't think that taxing people reduces their autonomy. Taxing people unfairly. So if a tax regime in which is not progressive or which is not heavily progressive, yeah, that's bad in various ways, including being unjust. But you're an autonomous adult, even though you pay your taxes. It's the capacity to judge and act on your judgment, not the capacity, not the money that you need, that you have. So that's what I would say about that. Now, the hard question, which I think two people basically asked the same hard question, or variants of it, which is if you have entirely government-run schools, the government can then mould the education the way they want to. They can impose official history curricula, which may or may not be entirely accurate. We all know in Russia that's what they have done for many years. They've, as regimes changed, so did history books, so did what people learned, and all that you could be sure of was that as the regimes changed and the history books changed, they contained different falsehoods, right? But all you knew when you read the book was that most of it wasn't true. And of course can turn children, instead of trying to develop their capacities for independent judgment, can try and suppress their capacity for independent judgment. So there are one thing to say is that's why I'm pretty careful, or try to be careful, not to tell people what to do. There are some contexts in which government-run schooling is going to be very problematic. North Korea. I would welcome a burgeoning of private education in North Korea. Okay? I would welcome it. I think it would be a good thing, probably. And I don't know, I don't know India's context well. One of the things that we seem to agree about is that our arguments don't imply that there shouldn't be any private sector at all. And in fact, I think there needs to be a private sector because I think you need to have some sort of, the public sector needs to have some sort of competitive pressure on it. In the UK, where I grew up, the private sector completely fails. We have a very robust private sector and it does not play a competitive role at all because it only is there to teach the elite. That's all it's there for. The education of regular people and the poor is not improved by the presence of that sector. In the US, the private sector actually does play that role. And I welcome that part of the private sector plays that role, in particular the diocesan Catholic schools in the US play that kind of role in a way that is healthy, I think, for public schooling. And I welcome that. I think there are also things you can do about the structure of government schools. So the structure of governance of government schools. In France, government schools are run, the largest sector of government schools are run pretty much from, and governed pretty much from Paris. In the UK, government schools are run and governed very locally. They have to abide by a national curriculum, but they have boards of governors who are drawn from the local citizenry. And the governors typically, even if the school is a religious government school, some of the governors will not be from that religion. And it's been deliberately structured that way to try and ensure against all schools being exactly the same and following the whims of whatever government is in power. So those are the comments I would make about that. And the comment about the private sector being unsuccessful despite there being lots of choice and variety, that's completely consistent with what. Just, you need choice and variety in order for it to succeed, but choice and variety don't make it succeed. You can still completely fail no matter what.
Thank you, for Professor Brighouse. We'll have another round, and maybe this time only 3 questions. So Prakash ji, how much time we have? We have Sharkuti ji, how much?
Usually to both, although there is one in which I'll identify the speaker. First is whatever the goals of education, both of you have indicated. I assume that means empowering the person in various ways. So I am using only one word, education is for empowerment. And accepting that, then I am proceeding further. Both of you, as was clearly remarked, did not take a clear position about state or market. And I think it's correct. I will say that both state and market are our centers. And they are not interested in empowering them. So I cannot trust either the market or the state to do justice with education. Therefore, one has to think of non-state, not market sector. And I suggest, first of course a question now, after giving this background, a question to Mr. Venu. You know, you were quite right, saying in Indian situation, the private sector is supposed to be doing non-profit. No profit for institution can run an educational institution. And yet all of them are running for profit, most of them. So don't we think it's the failure of the state? And maybe if this is really state intervenes and makes them only private institutions for profit, not profit, then maybe the kind of safe space that you are looking for, the protection for civil society initiatives, will be available. Therefore, the final question that I have is, both the state and market will want subservient people, will not want what we really are looking for. Don't you think it is possible to think of intellectuals as the other power center in the society that might be interested in really empowering? And therefore, cooperatives of teachers, cooperatives of neighborhood, although both of you talked about the failures of household to take decisions, I will say ultimately in a democratic setup one has to accept that households gradually can understand what they really want and need. So don't you think cooperatives of teachers, cooperatives of parents, cooperatives of, let's say, intellectuals are a more appropriate source than the state? Or
tell us if under what conditions can we call education as a public good? And the reason I ask is because, as the previous question clearly said, that neither of you take a rigid position on state or market, and I think that is the sophisticated, although not a quick fix answer. Would clearly defining education as a public good and the sense in which it could be viewed, that would that enhance and strengthen some argument about how, under what conditions would a private entity be able to produce a public good, and under what conditions would the state be able to be regulated by some kind of a civil society force to actually produce that public good?
I'm an alumni of Krishna India. My question is to Professor Venu. You said policy options are more hybrid than just looking at it as public versus private. So I'd like to know from you if you think, in your opinion, there's a perfect recipe or an equation for a public-private partnership. What's the ideal PPP model? And my second question is, would the US charter school system work in India? And if it would, what would the biggest challenges for it to work?
For privatization. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on that? What are the points that you consider as justification for privatization?
There are all the Indian commissions, education commissions and policies recommended common school system, but not implemented in our government. But in a present context, that one is required or not justified.
I actually, I think I agree. I mean, I'm not sure I agree to the extent that I think that all schools should be run by cooperatives of teachers, intellectuals and parents. But I do think whether you, maybe this is another point about the government-run system, it's very important to think about teachers and parents, and we haven't mentioned them, but probably very important, school principals, people who run schools. Teachers have a lot of control, teachers and principals have a lot of control over what happens in schools, and parents have a fair amount of power over what happens in schools, even when there aren't markets, as long as the state isn't totally repressive. And having a kind of sense of professional ethic among teachers can guard against lots of the problems with that people worry about with government schooling. And especially having the right kind of ethos among people who manage teachers and people who prepare them for teaching, people who educate teachers. And all of that for a healthy, whether it's a government school system or a market school system or a system run by cooperatives, it's not going to be a healthy and good school system unless it has teachers who are skilled and committed to continuing to develop their skills throughout their career, and principals who understand that their job is to make sure that instruction is high quality and continues to be high quality and improve. Did somebody ask, would the US style of school system work in India? Yes, I thought so. So I don't think the US type of school system works in the US. Maybe it would work in India, but I'm skeptical. And one of the reasons is that and this is not true in the Catholic schools, but it is true in lots of public schools. It doesn't have to do with the teachers so much as the principals. The principals are, the culture of the principalship is kind of a disaster. They see themselves as running, they basically see themselves as running prisons with professional athletic teams attached to them, right? Only it's worse because, if you're running a prison, at least you don't have these parents coming in and bugging you all the time, right? And I think it's a very unhealthy way of looking at what you're doing. And they don't see themselves really as running places where the development, education and flourishing of the child is centre stage. And that's very problematic, and that's, a lot of that is about culture. It's not, which is very hard to do, it's hard to get into figuring out what to do about that. I don't think that, so I think education is both a public good and a private good. It has public and private aspects to it, and it's public, partly public, partly private, regardless of how it's provided. I don't think that stipulating that it's a public good really makes a difference to who should provide it. In some circumstances, for some goods, markets are better providing them, providing the public aspect of them than governments, only if they're regulated reasonably well, as has been said. And in other circumstances and for other goods, governments are better at it. There are some well, that's just not a very helpful thing to say, but that's what I would say.
Each of them can be the theme for one of these panel discussions. So I'm not sure we can do justice to them. Perhaps only touch upon some of the aspects of each of these questions. Firstly, about Behar Sahib's question about what does the failure of the private sector or the success of the private sector to extract surplus, what does it tell about our regulatory system? See, what does the utter failure of traffic rules tell about our regulatory system and ourselves? I'm using a trivial example. It does indeed tell us that the regulatory system has failed because the evidence is before us. But it's also true that the regulatory system has been overwhelmed. Given the traffic, the way traffic functions and people drive in this country, it's true that traffic rules are not a widely shared set of constraints on our behavior. Right? And therefore, any regulatory system which tries to impose or bring about compliance will be overwhelmed and often co-opted or undermined. Right? I don't at all intend to imply that the traffic system and the education system are similar beyond the superficial. But some of those kind of ethical approaches or ethical stances have also contributed to the corruption of the education system and other regulatory failures. So one is, of course, the regulatory failure involved in looking at regulation as merely control. Okay? And secondly, treating most of the regulatory effort as legal rather than prescriptive or even facilitative. Right? So these kind of approaches to regulation have resulted in a very fertile and productive industry in sidestepping regulation. Right? And that works within a background context where rules and regulations are seen as merely inconveniences to be sidestepped rather than reflective of a society's ethical commitments. Right? Now that movement, I don't think, again, to move away from a very straightforward either or kind of, is it regulation or is it compliance? It's both. To the question about whether intellectuals and cooperatives can do something about this, yes, of course. That's perhaps the only a groundswell of public and civil society action that can bring about some kind of, or bring about a virtuous cycle of change. But at least if that doesn't work, we'll have to go back to the drawing board. The question about the nature of public goods and private goods, yes, education is both. Under what condition can a private entity produce that public good? Under a condition where that private entity is fully committed to the public purpose. And that, I think, is very much possible. There is a strong history of civil society initiatives where private initiatives are fully committed to seeing education and committed to education as a public purpose, as enhancing the quality of public life and the capability of future citizens. Under those conditions, truly where initiatives subscribe to that and not merely to economic outcomes, private initiatives can produce those public goods just as well. About public-private partnerships, India has a long history of public-private partnerships. It's not new at all. It is, and that right from the turn of the last century. And slowly over time, these partnerships morphed into what we call aided institutions. Public aided institutions are nothing but private-public partnerships. The Exchequer picks up some of the needs for resources of these institutions, and private managements in the early days, motivated by very serious public purpose, took on the responsibility for running these institutions. I myself studied in a school which was set up in 1905 by a band of Theosophists and Annie Besant, who were truly inspired by both the fervor of the independence movement and a progressive vision of education. By the time the school came to the early 2000s, much of that fervor, or most of it, had been lost. It had become a public school except in name. And like most private aided schools, the management was selling teachers' position in the school because the salaries are paid by the government for a few lakh rupees. Right? So this history should tell us both about the constraints or that new imagination. If a public-private partnership has to originate, where private enthusiasm and capabilities are harnessed and supported by public funding for the public good, we need a new organizational imagination. About my argument that government failure is not a reason for privatization. Under what circumstances will government failure be a strong argument for privatization? If we can demonstrate that government failure is the result of, incontrovertibly, the result of the government's inability, supported by evidence, to run any initiative, educational initiative, or it could be a health initiative. In that case, we have to look for alternatives. Then it's a good argument for moving away. But if government failure is the result of identifiable causes and rectifiable situations, then it's a strong argument for doing that, to identify the causes and improve the situation. Not for, it does not give an iota of support for saying that privatization is a result. Privatization has to be supported for the arguments for privatization. Lastly, the common school system, perhaps Rohit is a better person to talk about that.
No, not about the common school system. I might say something, but I think I'll say three things. I certainly will not try to wrap up and conclude, etc. But three things came to my mind, and I might say something about the common school system as well. But the three things which came to my mind is that this private is fast approaching the ambiguity of dharma in our society. You know, dharma, when someone says, it could be interpreted as religion, it could be interpreted as morality, it could be interpreted as physical property. Now, when we say private, I think at least three distinguishable things are in that. Civil society initiatives which are voluntary initiatives and not for profit at all, and usually are addressing some problem in any sector they are doing. So when we are actually discussing in today's context public-private, then perhaps that's not really the issue. The second is what Venu mentioned as this old public-private. That was actually based on philanthropy from some people, and then the government also added in that. So we are not really talking about the civil society initiatives and philanthropy. We are basically talking about the market initiatives for profit. That perhaps is the crux of the private. So that is one little comment I wanted to make. Two are more in the lighter vein. You see, this culture of principles that you mentioned just now as a problem in the American public school system. We in India at the moment have very strong votaries for developing this culture of principleship in our system, and many people see it as the way to improve the schools. So I think this is a warning. We should at least study where the developed culture of principleship is found, what it has done to the schools. This would be a good idea to look at that. The third thing is, thank you Venu for reminding this traffic thing. Often for last 4 years, since I am in Bangalore and I drive from home to the university, this idea comes to my mind often to suggest to some social scientist that perhaps looking at the traffic and studying the traffic could be very good indicator for the civic concern for the others and the concern for social justice. If you consider time and road space as publicly shared property on which everyone has equal right, and then you conduct the research how people hope that, then perhaps you can say something about the value of social justice in the public generally. Now, common school system is, it seems that this is too complex an issue. Historically, we never had a common school system. This was, it seems to me, came together with the imagination of the nation during the freedom struggle, and imagination of a certain kind of society. This actually, I do not know how long one can talk about it, therefore I wouldn't go too far into this. The issue is that there are social and political forces in the society which definitely do want better education for their children. And this idea will never allow, I shouldn't say never allow, will always resist a common school system. If I look at my own childhood, all the schools in the rural Rajasthan, in the area where I come from, were government schools. There were not any private schools. But as soon as people had some more money, and maybe by that time government schools also started deteriorating, now there are series of schools on different fee slabs. So that in a way, tentative common schooling which was available to all the rural people in that small area, because of that wanting to give better advantageous and competitive education to their own children, that system is actually now slabbed into various kinds of layers. Therefore, unless until we have very well thought law and we can improve the quality of all government schools, I don't think we can move towards that. Well, I think we should thank both the speakers, and thank you very much for so very, very thoughtful questions, as well as being with us for, I think this was a very good session, and contribution is both from the speakers and from the audience. Thank you very much.
ಕಾಪಿ ಮಾಡ್ಬಿಡ ಹಂಗೆ ಕಾಪಿ ಮಾಡ್ಬಿಡ